So before we go any further, it'd probably be good to establish what effect is for our listeners who might not know about it. So could you give us the elevator pitch for it?
Sure. So kind of like our catchphrase or core like proponent is that Effect is a library for developing production grade applications with TypeScript. That's like kind of our North Star and what we've always built towards. But I think it goes much further than that. I think that we develop Effect to be I don't know a better way to say this, but we develop it kind of to be like a boring library. We wanted to take care of all of the aspects of your code that you have to deal with on a regular basis that you don't want to have to deal with. You know, as an engineer, we want to focus on the fun stuff about our code. We want to focus on developing features for our users, providing value to the people who are using our software. And because of that, when we traditionally develop applications in TypeScript, we end up ignoring a lot of the aspects of development that are kind of critical to providing a good user experience, but not necessarily the most fun things to have to deal with when you're actually developing your application. Things like error handling, interrupting processes during execution of your application, properly testing things, like things that we just like, we know we have to do at some point, but you don't necessarily have to do upfront when you only have 10 users, right? But what we've seen is that with Effect, the logic behind developing Effect is as your application grows and you need to make it more production grade, we've seen that you end up introducing a lot of ancillary code into your code base to kind of deal with these concerns, deal with things like observability, deal with things like retries, deal with things like interruption, deal with things like error handling. And what ends up happening is your code becomes less about the features and more about dealing with all of these kind of ancillary aspects. And so you start accumulating all of this tech debt, and then you become afraid to start adding new features, right? Because you've got this kind of mess of code that you've developed in order to handle these ancillary concerns. And now you kind of don't know what's making your code work, what's going to break if you change this. I don't have enough test coverage. And so the real logic behind why we developed Effect, or why Effect was developed in the first place, was to take care of all of these cross-cutting concerns and allow you as the developer to focus on the core logic, the features, the things that you want to provide to your users, and let us deal with all of kind of the boring aspects of your code. So when you're writing applications with Effect, you end up with a much more highly composable piece of software. So you don't end up having to deal with writing your own implementation of like a retry or dealing with integrating observability into your code base because it's built into the core framework. So that was kind of like a long-winded elevator pitch, but that's kind of the logic behind why the Effect was developed in the first place, and why we're continuing to develop it the way we are.
So I've heard it positioned as like the missing standard library for TypeScript. And so I just kind of want to dig into that a little bit more. What specific gaps in the ecosystem do you think Effect is filling? And like, how would it compare to just like, I don't know, collaborating together a lot of your own tools like Lodash and Zod and RxJS and, other tools in the framework, maybe even historically FPTS to like kind of solve some of these problems for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I'm going to make a little bit of a bold claim and say that Effect, if you're integrating Effect into your code base, you can sort of replace all of those ancillary libraries, the libraries that allow you to do things like, have utility methods or, deal with streaming, whatever. You can replace many of those just by integrating Effect into your code base. And kind of the benefit that you get is the same problem that exists in the TypeScript ecosystem right now to begin with, or you kind of gain the benefit of everything is developed to work together. Everything is developed to compose with one another. So if you're using Effect for your core business logic and you introduce a part of your application that needs to stream something, Effect has streaming primitives that you can use to deal with that. You don't have to introduce another library. You've already got it built in. and it's designed to compose. I think in a lot of the code bases we've seen over the years, the problem with the NPM ecosystem, first of all, it's a wonderful ecosystem. TypeScript, JavaScript probably has the best ecosystem community of developed libraries that exists on the planet, right? It's fantastic to be a part of this ecosystem. But the problem is that these tools were developed in isolation. They weren't designed to work together. So if you all of a sudden have a need for streaming, right? You need to introduce a new library to deal with that. And that library may not work with the library that you introduced to deal with errors, or the library that you introduced to deal with observability, or whatever other problems you're trying to deal with in your code base. So then you have to write the glue code to deal with integrating this library with this library to then be able to integrate with your business logic. So you're writing like a lot of extra code just to be able to use the library that you introduced to deal with a specific problem. I think one of the benefits you get with Effect is that everything is designed to work together. You don't have to deal with all of that glue code. You just plug and play wherever you need. Oftentimes, like we hear developers who start working with Effect say that it feels like programming with like Lego blocks, because you can just swap pieces in and out as you need them. If you need a retry here, great, plug in a retry, right? If you need observability in this particular area, fine, just wrap your code with a with span, right? It's much more, the design decisions that we put into developing the library are made in a way that is to foster composition. And that's not just with the core library, but it's also with all of the ecosystem libraries that we're developing as well.
So that's probably kind of the road that led you guys to having such a large library. Like, I think, yeah, the effect docs are a little daunting. There is so much it does, but it's probably all in service of that kind of like fidelity of it all just like fitting together like Lego blocks, right?
Yeah, I think that you bring up a good point, which is that, the library, it does require some buy-in up front, right? And we're sensitive to that as well, right? We know that there's a little bit of a learning curve when it comes to approaching Effect from the beginning, right? And in many cases, that learning curve is not something people want to deal with when your app has 10 users, right? We're not designing Effect for like that type of adoption. We're designing it for folks who want to really build like robust production grade systems in TypeScript. So to kind of comment further on your point about us having so many ecosystem libraries, I think the decision point about when we introduce a new library or not really comes when we as a team have a need for something, because we dog food our own software very heavily, and it doesn't exist. Or somebody in our community says, hey, we have a need for XYZ. Like, is this being developed? Can we work on it? Whatever. And that's kind of sort of how the ecosystems come together over time. I think some of the best software that is built comes from your own need of like something, right? I think a good example of this is the CLI framework that we have in Effect, which I built a while back. At the time, Effect didn't have a CLI framework, and I needed to build a CLI, and I didn't want to use something that wasn't Effect, or I wanted to use something that had native integration with Effect. And so that was kind of how like the CLI framework evolved, right? It was developed out of need, out of want. And that's sort of how our ecosystem has grown over time as well. And kind of also, like you mentioned, every library that we that we have in our ecosystem is designed to compose with the core primitives that we have. So if you're building an Effect program and then all of a sudden you have need of like a database, well, you can use our SQL adapters, and then whichever database you have, you can sort of plug in whichever one you want. We're that's kind of the logic behind why we're developing the ecosystem the way we are. Like, if we think that there's a need for some library in a production grade system, That's kind of like how we decide whether or not something's going to be introduced into the ecosystem.